Have you ever had that feeling, that a really crucial part of history was missing? Or maybe that certain stories were just, well, intentionally left out?
Mm-hmm. It happens all the time, doesn't it? We get these broad strokes, the big events, but so much gets lost in the details, in the suppressed narratives.
Exactly. And sometimes it's those unseen currents, those uncomfortable truths, where the deepest insights actually lie. It reminds me of what Leslie Feinberg said.
Oh, the historian and activist.
Yeah,
Yeah.
about searching for yourself in history and just finding nothing. No one like you. How incredibly disorienting, how unmooring that can be.
It really is that feeling of being ahistorical, like you just popped into existence without any roots. It's a direct result of that erasure, isn't it?
Definitely. And it hits marginalized communities the hardest, making it seem like their experiences are somehow new or disconnected.
And it's rarely accidental. It's often about power, about who gets
Yeah.
to decide whose story matters, whose life is valued, who's remembered.
Which is precisely what we want to challenge in our deep dive today.
Right. We're aiming to trace this complex, often hidden history of Black queer experiences. We're going from, the brutal realities of transatlantic slavery.
All the way up to the vibrant art scenes like the Harlem Renaissance and the struggles that continue today.
And it's not just about finding forgotten names, though that's part of it. It's really about understanding how power and sexuality and race have constantly intersected.
Intertwined, yeah. Sometimes violently, but also in really surprising ways, shaping identities, shaping whole communities over centuries.
What's really key here, I think, is seeing how queerness and Blackness weren't these separate boxes. They were forces that often worked together, consciously or not, to defy and resist oppressive systems.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll be getting into some tough stuff. How sexual violence was used as a tool of power in slavery.
And how hidden relationships, queer relationships, formed even in those utterly unthinkable conditions.
And crucially, how that historical trauma echoes, how it still reverberates today, sometimes even showing up as homophobia within Black communities themselves. It's a difficult conversation, but a necessary one.
Definitely. We'll look at historical figures who challenged norms, at art that managed to express both incredible pain and defiant joy.
And even a modern-day tragedy that sort of ripped the lid off some deep-seated biases,
Yeah.
showing how these patterns persist.
So yeah, get ready everyone to unpack some really important, sometimes challenging truths with us as we explore this vital history.
Okay, let's dive in. Where do we start? It feels like we have to begin in a really difficult place. The reality of slavery.
I think we do. And when we think about the violence of that period, the images that come to mind are usually, the whip, the physical labor, families being torn apart.
Right, those horrific visible scars.
Exactly. But there's this other dimension, one that's often shrouded in silence: sexual violence. And importantly, this wasn't just violence directed at enslaved women.
That's a crucial point. Because while the vast majority of recorded sexual violence did target women, male-on-male sexual abuse, that was also part of it, wasn't it? Documented, even if sparsely.
Yes, documented, though often just in fleeting mentions. You have to remember the broader society at the time had intense hostility towards any kind of same-sex activity. It was condemned morally, legally.
So the fact it appears in records at all is pretty significant.
Hugely significant. You find these chilling hints in slave narratives. Harriet Jacobs' incidents in the life of a slave girl, for example, seems to allude quite clearly, though very discreetly, to non-consensual sexual exploitation by white masters involving men.
Almost unspeakable, even when recounting other horrors.
Exactly. And it wasn't just the enslaved people writing about it, often carefully for abolitionist audiences. You even find glimpses in the private diaries of the enslavers themselves.
Really? Like who?
Well, there's the infamous Thomas Thistlewood, a slave owner in Jamaica back in the 1700s. His diaries are notoriously detailed about his brutality, but he also briefly notes an accusation against another slave owner.
Accused of sodomy with one of his male domestic servants. The fact that these details, however few, made it into print or private records, given the intense social pressure for secrecy and condemnation, it tells you something about how pervasive this must have been, even if hidden.
So why is uncovering this specific type of violence so important? What does it tell us about power dynamics during slavery?
Fundamentally, it tells us that this sexual exploitation was about absolute power. It was about humiliation, about stripping away humanity, far more than just physical desire.
Especially for male victims, right? In a society so rigidly gendered.
Precisely. Masculinity was tied to ideas of strength, protection, control. To be subjected to sexual violence by another man, particularly a white master, was a profound assault on dignity, on personhood, amplifying the brutality of enslavement itself.
And the fact that enslavers could do this, keep it secret, face no consequences.
Was a terrifying demonstration of their absolute arbitrary control over enslaved bodies. Every aspect of life, even the most intimate, was subject to their whim and their violence.
So it wasn't just the act itself, but the symbolic weight it carried.
Exactly. And even abolitionist writers at the time sometimes recognized this specific horror, framing sexual abuse by masters as a sign of their ultimate depravity, a particular masculine act of depravity, as one source put it.
So the historical record, even being so scarce on this point, is crucial for validating these experiences.
Absolutely. It helps us understand the full scope of dehumanization. And while we're focusing here on male violence because it's so often ignored, we have to remember this dynamic of sexualized control crossed all gender lines, just manifesting differently depending on who was involved. The core was always control and dehumanization.
It really forces you to rethink the conventional picture of violence and slavery, doesn't it? It's more complex, more insidious.
It is. And understanding this painful piece is vital for grasping the long-term impact on ideas about masculinity, power, and sexuality that we still grapple with today.
Which brings us to another challenging idea. This concept of the homoerotic gaze of white mastery. Can you unpack that for us? It sounds quite intense.
It is intense, and it's a difficult but important concept from historians analyzing slavery. The argument, essentially, is that the forced sexual submission of enslaved people wasn't just incidental violence.
Yeah.
It was actually integrated into the being of white mastery. These performative gestures of white sexual ownership, the demands for sexual acts, became intertwined with what some scholars call the ontology of white homoerotic desire.
Wow. So you're saying the power itself was sexualized?
In a deeply disturbing way, yes. For some slaveholders, their absolute control wasn't just about economics or status. It was tied to a twisted form of pleasure derived from the forced submission and violation of enslaved bodies, blurring lines between public spectacle and private act, and often between male and female targets. It was systemic.
Profoundly disturbing. I remember reading Walter Johnson, who talks about slave breaking as more than just physical punishment.
Exactly. Johnson calls it a technology of the soul. He suggests that the master's power was a kind of fantasy, embodied in the public subjugation of another person. This public degradation, this absolute control, could itself become erotically charged for the enslaver.
Blurring public and private, male and female.
Suggesting mastery itself, that absolute power, became deeply entangled with a form of homoeroticism.
Yeah.
Not necessarily attraction in the way we think of it now, but a desire rooted in domination and sexualized power over another human.
And this connects to Saidiya Hartman's work too, doesn't it? The economy of enjoyment.
Yes, precisely.
Yep.
Hartman talks about the pornotropic black spectacle, the way black bodies were constantly displayed, examined, and used, often in sexualized ways, creating a kind of perverse enjoyment and profit for white society. It wasn't just about labor. Black bodies themselves became objects of a violent, exploitative gaze.
Is there specific work that really dives into this?
A really key text here is Vincent Woodard's The Delectable Negro, Human Consumption and Homoeroticism in Black Men's Writing. It's groundbreaking. Woodard looks at human cannibalism in slavery, both literally and figuratively.
Cannibalism. How so?
He defines consumption really broadly through practices like forced starvation, the brutal seasoning process for new arrivals, and crucially, through sexual exploitation. He argues these were all ways of consuming the enslaved person.
Okay, I see.
But critically, Woodard complicates the picture. He argues that homoeroticism wasn't just white men targeting black men. He suggests it also emanated from black men toward white men and toward each other, which really challenges a simple one-way power dynamic.
That adds another layer of complexity. He even talks about figures like Alada Equiano, right?
Yes. Woodard points out how Equiano's documented fears of being literally eaten by Europeans seem intertwined with what Woodard interprets as homoerotic attachments to white men. It suggests an incredibly complex, fraught psychological space for enslaved people navigating these power dynamics.
And Frederick Douglass.
Woodard suggests Douglass may have been raped, analyzing his writings to argue that Douglass portrays slavery itself as this cannibalistic institution that consumes the entire being of the enslaved.
Wow. This really uncovers such a hidden, brutal dimension of slavery. It goes way beyond simple ideas of sexuality.
It absolutely does. It shows how ownership and power bled into the most intimate parts of life, shaping identity for everyone involved in truly horrific ways. It's a difficult truth, but ignoring it leaves our understanding of this history fundamentally incomplete.
Okay, let's shift our focus slightly out onto the water of the Black Atlantic. The Middle Passage is usually understood purely as the site of trauma and death.
And it absolutely was that, unquestionably. The scale of suffering is almost unimaginable.
But the scholar Omisik Natasha Tinsley offers this really radical reframing.
Yeah.
The Black Atlantic has always been the queer Atlantic. What does she mean by that?
It's a really powerful intervention. Tinsley asks us to see the slave ships not just as vessels of trauma, but also as mobile elements, as material sites where queer relationships and connections were actually possible, were actually formed.
How does that differ from earlier scholarship, like Paul Gilroy's work?
Well, Gilroy's The Black Atlantic was hugely important, establishing the Atlantic as this space of cultural exchange and black modernity. But his focus was often more abstract, treating the ocean and ships almost like phantom metaphors.
Right, less about the literal journeys.
Exactly. And sexuality, in Gilroy's framework, often became a metaphor for pain, rather than being seen as an embodied experience, a site of potential connection, or even resistance. Tinsley brings it back to the material reality of the ships.
So she's saying that within those horrific conditions, people formed bonds.
Yes. He emphasizes how captive African women formed erotic bonds with other women in the sex-segregated holds, and men formed bonds with men. And this wasn't just incidental.
Not just survival.
Not just survival. She frames it as a profound act of self-assertion, a way of reclaiming their bodies and desires against a system trying to reduce them to mere commodities, to brute matter.
So these were actual chosen relationships.
She describes them as highly charged volitional relationships, forged in the fire of shared trauma and the fight for survival. The simple act of feeling and feeling for the kidnapped, as she puts it, was itself an assertion of sentience, of humanity.
That's incredible. Are there traces of this left?
There are linguistic traces, yes, in different parts of the diaspora. Like in Suriname, the term mimati. Literally it means male or shipmate, but it's used between female lovers to mean my girl.
Wow, so the term itself references that shared origin on the ship.
Exactly. It signifies a chosen bond rooted in shared experience, not biology. There are other examples too, the Brazilian malungo, used for shipmates across genders, the Haitian bâtiment, the Surinamese sipi. These words are echoes of those same-sex non-biological bonds formed in the holds.
They're like little historical markers hidden in language.
Precisely. They tell a story of resilience, intimacy, and queer connection forged under the most brutal circumstances imaginable. It fundamentally shifts how we think about agency and connection during the Middle Passage.
It really does. It shows that even in the face of total dehumanization, people found ways to assert their humanity, their desires, their selves. Queer life wasn't absent, it was there, resisting.
And building on that idea of fluidity, it's crucial to remember that rigid gender binaries, just male or female, weren't necessarily the norm in many pre-colonial African societies. Gender variance has a long, complex history.
So the strict binary was largely imposed.
Yes, colonization and chattel slavery actively worked to standardize gender according to white European Christian values. They forced enslaved people into rigid categories that often erased their own cultural understandings or their lived experiences under slavery.
This makes me think about Western queer theory. It often started from a very white, Eurocentric perspective, right?
It did, often operating from an uncolor-coded perspective, only belatedly trying to grapple with race. Tinsley cuts right through that, asking, does this queer sea have a color? She's pushing for metaphors, like the Black Atlantic itself, to be materially informed, to actually account for the specific racialized experiences of Black queer people, not just offer an abstract notion of fluidity.
So it needs to be grounded in that specific history.
Exactly. Think about Diane Brand's writing, like Map to the Door of No Return. She describes figures who escaped slavery, the Maroons, as unsexed, irreducibly opaque, their bodies almost reshaped by the experience, distorted beyond naturalizable gender. The sea itself becomes this queer space, seeing the memory of the Middle Passage.
And art becomes a way to express this fluidity, too.
Absolutely. Think of Jackie Kay's novel Trumpet. It's about Joss, a Black Scottish jazz musician who's revealed to be a woman after death.
I remember that book.
Kay describes Joss's trumpet playing as liberating, to be a girl, to be a man. It shows how art can transcend, can even undo these fixed categories of race, gender, sexuality imposed by society. Identity becomes performed, lived, found in that creative expression.
It's like finding freedom within the art form itself.
Precisely. And even think about those seemingly tiny details, like an asterisk in an old slave ship log, originally just marking something deleted or edited out.
Yeah.
Queer activists have reclaimed that symbol. It now signifies the erased lives, the silenced stories of enslaved Africans. It takes that mark of erasure and turns it into a demand to remember, to see what was deliberately hidden.
That's powerful, turning silence into a statement.
It really challenges our fixed ideas about gender and identity. It shows how Black queer people have always embodied fluidity and resistance. Just by existing, by creating, by refusing to be neatly categorized, it forces us to look differently at history, to listen to its silences.
Okay, let's move forward in time after slavery. The early 20th century, particularly the Harlem Renaissance. This seems like a key moment.
Oh, absolutely. It was an incredible period of cultural explosion, and within that, a really vibrant subculture of LGBTQ African American artists and entertainers emerged and found space in Harlem.
We're talking about some major figures here, right?
Definitely. People like Alain Locke, the philosopher often called the Dean of the Renaissance, who was gay. Literary giants like Langston Hughes, whose sexuality is still debated but whose work resonates with queer themes. And Richard Bruce Nugent, who was openly queer.
And beyond the writers.
You had powerhouse performers like the blues singer Bessie Smith, who had relationships with men and women. And Gladys Bentley, the pianist and singer who performed in men's clothing, was openly lesbian and even had a highly publicized wedding to a woman.
It sounds like there was a real scene, a community.
There was. Langston Hughes wrote about the incredible drag balls at places like the Savoy Ballroom. He called them spectacles of color, and noted how many men felt comfortable appearing in drag publicly in Harlem, more so than perhaps anywhere else at the time. It was a space for queer expression.
That sounds amazing, but there were still complex dynamics, right? Especially with white patrons.
Absolutely. Richard Bruce Nugent, for instance, used his art and persona to resist being consumed by white interest. His character Stuart in the novel Gentleman Jigger embodies this deliberate unpleasantness.
Unpleasantness. How so?
Stuart refuses to be easily digestible or enjoyable for the white days. He's witty, sharp, maybe a bit difficult. It's a way of asserting autonomy, refusing to perform blackness or queerness for white consumption, or at least demanding something tangible in return.
That speaks volumes about the power dynamics. Like with Carl Van Vechten.
Exactly. Van Vechten, the white novelist and photographer, his book Nigger Heaven was controversial, condemned by Du Bois for exploitation. Yet he was deeply interested in black artists, hosted integrated salons.
A complicated figure.
Very. Nugent's portrayal of characters like Van Vechten captures that tension, how even relationships between artists could echo those older power dynamics, the surveillance of slave traders, the debonair threatening of masters. It was a constant negotiation.
And someone like Langston Hughes? Possibly closeted due to societal pressures.
Yes, the need to maintain a certain public image for funding and acceptance was immense, but many scholars find subtle homosexual codes woven into his work, ways of expressing identity beneath the surface.
So the Renaissance was this incredible moment of resilience, creativity, community building.
All while navigating intense racism and homophobia from the broader society and complex dynamics within the artistic scene itself. It shows the drive for self-expression, for belonging, even under immense pressure. Art became a vital space for resistance and truth.
But moving beyond that specific era, the reality for many black LGBTQ individuals remains navigating a sort of double burden, doesn't it?
Yes, unfortunately. Statistically, about 4.6% of African Americans identify as LGBTQ, and they often face both racism and anti-LGBTQ discrimination, sometimes from within their own communities, sometimes from outside. It's a constant balancing act.
We have seen some positive shifts, though.
Definitely. Organizations like the NAACP endorsing same-sex marriage was huge. President Obama's support was a major milestone. And the Black Lives Matter movement, critically, was founded by queer black women and has intentionally centered black LGBTQ voices from the start.
That's incredibly important, recognizing the intersectionality of struggles.
It is. But alongside that progress, there's still this difficult internal issue within some parts of the black community. The scholar Donnie Moreland talks about what he calls, metaphorically, an intercommunal pogrom against queer black men.
Oh, pogrom. That's a strong word.
He uses it metaphorically to describe a kind of systemic rejection, an ostracization, often framed as needing to protect black masculinity from feminization. Moreland argues this comes from a place of deep historical trauma.
How so?
He suggests it's rooted in warped power fantasies, an attempt to distance the community from the painful memory of slavery, where black men were indeed vulnerable to sexual violation under the power of white enslavers.
So it's like a misdirected defense mechanism.
Exactly. And tragically, the burdens of shame from that history get projected onto queer black men. They become scapegoats in what Moreland calls an absurd rewriting of history, blamed for vulnerabilities that stem directly from white supremacy.
That's incredibly painful, turning the trauma inward.
It is, and it leads to devastating consequences. Think about the AIDS epidemic in the 80s and 90s.
It hit the black community hard, especially gay and bisexual men.
Extremely hard. Yet it was often ignored or downplayed by mainstream black leadership, by hetero thought leaders. This silence, this internal stigma, contributed to the loss of so many brilliant minds, like the writer Joseph Beam, the poet Essex Hemphill.
Hemphill's quote comes to mind. Something about the oppressed needing an other.
Yes. Even among the oppressed, there is a disturbing need for a convenient other to vent anger against. It's a chillingly accurate description of how internalized oppression can work, creating divisions within communities fighting for liberation.
It really highlights the urgency of confronting those internal biases, doesn't it, for true collective liberation.
Absolutely. It requires self-reflection and a commitment to ensuring that freedom and safety extend to everyone within the community.
Let's look at a more recent, very public example where these dynamics played out. The Jeffrey Dahmer case in 1991.
A truly horrific case. Dahmer, a white man, murdered numerous young men, most of whom were black, and he chillingly referred to them as his love slaves.
And the media coverage. How did that handle the racial and sexual dimensions?
That's the crucial part. While Dahmer was condemned, the mainstream media coverage often sidestepped the specific racialized and sexualized nature of his crimes against black men. It detached his violence from that longer history of same-gender abuse and racial terror we've been discussing.
So it became just about a serial killer, not about race or the specific vulnerability of black gay men.
Largely, yes. The framing often aimed for white comfort, glossing over gruesome details, especially those highlighting the racial targeting. It falls into what the philosopher Charles W. Mills called an epistemology of ignorance.
An epistemology of ignorance.
Yeah, a kind of systemic, willful blindness, structuring public knowledge to avoid uncomfortable truths, especially truths that challenge white dominance or expose specific vulnerabilities of marginalized groups. It insulated the predominantly white audience from confronting the reality of violence against black queer lives.
I remember seeing talk shows about it at the time.
Exactly. Like on one show, the new Tri-Cable Tonight, you saw these dynamics play out live. A white gay man from an LGBTQ organization spoke, and he blamed the police for incompetence towards the entire gay community.
Which might be true, but...
But it universalized the issue, right? It shifted focus away from the specific fact that Dahmer overwhelmingly targeted black men. It made it about general police failure towards gay people, erasing the racial specificity.
Oh, okay. What else happened on that show?
Then a black gay man spoke up. He expressed frustration with both the white mainstream and the black community for failing black queer people, even mentioning a nonchalant reaction within the black gay community itself.
A really complex perspective.
Incredibly complex. But instead of exploring that nuance, the show immediately pushed him to elaborate on homophobia within the black community. He was put on the spot, live on TV, forced to explain internal community issues, diverting attention again.
Placing the burden entirely on him.
Exactly. But then a black woman in the audience cut through it all. She said powerfully that the victim's sexual preference isn't the primary concern here. It's that we can all be victims.
Bringing it back to the core racial trauma.
Yes, and she called out the imposition of white communities, telling the black community how they should feel or react. She recentered the conversation on racial violence.
And Tracy Edwards, the survivor.
His testimony was crucial. As the analysis points out, his account, the way the media grappled with his blackness while trying to evoke empathy, inadvertently exposed the membrane of intentionality behind that superficial empathy. It revealed how applying racial stereotypes, even seemingly sympathetic ones, implicated whiteness in this larger history.
So the Dahmer case becomes this stark example of how historical patterns, racial violence, sexual violence, erasure, prioritizing white comfort, keep playing out.
Precisely. It forces us to critically examine how stories are told, whose pain is centered, and whose comfort is prioritized, especially when race, gender, and sexuality intersect. The echoes of history are right there in our contemporary media.
So navigating all this pain, this erasure, Where do people find this strength to resist, to create, to assert their humanity?
Well, one powerful way is through narrative, through art, and sometimes through what we might call unpleasantness. Black pain and memory in this context aren't just sources of suffering, they become entry points to self-understanding, a methodology of self-making.
Resisting those white emotional economies that want to consume or exploit Black suffering.
Exactly. Think back to the slave narratives. Even though they often had to fit certain molds to appeal to white abolitionists, they were still grappling with how to articulate the unspeakable, challenging literary forms, subtly asserting selfhood.
And that idea of unpleasantness we touched on with Richard Bruce Nugent's character, Stuart.
Right. That refusal to be easily palatable, easily enjoyable for white consumption, was a form of asserting autonomy. Stuart's wit, his refusal to perform gratitude or deference, it wasn't just attitude, it was a strategy of self-preservation, a refusal to reenact the performances of mastery.
It connects to Saidiya Hartman's idea of waywardness, doesn't it?
Perfectly. Hartman sees waywardness, refusal, escape, living outside prescribed norms as a key mode of resistance for Black people, especially Black women, historically. It acknowledges the paradox of cramped creation, finding ways to be free even within intense constraint. It reclaims histories that were ignored precisely because they were resistant or non-conforming.
So resistance isn't always neat or respectable. It can be sharp, difficult, unpleasant.
It absolutely can. It's found in radical self-affirmation, in refusing to be defined by the oppressor's terms, finding agency even in discomfort, turning it into a source of power.
If the official archives often fail to capture these stories, literature becomes incredibly important then. Like Toni Morrison's Beloved.
Monumentally important. Beloved is a masterclass in using fiction for historical recovery. Morrison uses intersectional methods, challenging heteronormative assumptions about plantation life and directly confronting the archival silence around same-gender abuse among enslaved men.
She tackles that screwed epistemology head-on.
Yes, that idea that the very structure of historical knowledge makes it hard to even name or validate Black queer experiences, especially experiences of violation. Morrison's work disrupts simplified narratives, even well-intentioned ones like Black is beautiful.
How so?
While empowering, that later focus could sometimes inadvertently smooth over the complexities and abuses within Black history, particularly those complicated ideas of Black masculinity. Morrison doesn't shy away from showing how slave owners had the power to violently redesign contemporary understandings of normative sexuality through abuse.
The scene with Paul D and the chain gang is unforgettable.
Utterly harrowing. The way Morrison describes the forced intimacy and violation built into the very act of chaining the men together. Homoerotic desires woven into the subjugation. The chain itself becomes this violating instrument, a self-penetrating orifice, its brutal realism about sexualized power.
But even there's resistance. Sixo's final moments.
Yes, that's the crucial counterpoint. As Sixo is recaptured and faces death, subjected to that same kind of white homoerotic violence, his laughter, his song, becomes this ultimate act of defiance.
How?
Morrison portrays it as expressing a kind of bottomhood, an internal state, perhaps even pleasure or self-authorship, that utterly defies slave owners' conception of Black sexuality. Even in total subjugation, his inner self remains beyond their grasp. His laughter asserts his enduring spirit.
It's incredible how literature can illuminate these hidden forms of resistance, things the archives just don't record.
It gives voice to the unspeakable. It forces us to confront the legacy of sexual violence and slavery and how it continues to shape ideas about Black masculinity, identity, and trauma today.
Which brings us to the absolute necessity of teaching this history, right? Queer people have always existed. Teach like it.
Exactly. That historical erasure we talked about at the beginning, it creates that profound unmooring. It makes people feel like aberrations, disconnected from the human story.
Like Leslie Feinberg felt, searching for a reflection and finding none.
Precisely, because history, as it's often taught, does not remember what it does not value. Power determines whose stories get told, whose lives are deemed worthy of memory.
So how do we teach it effectively? It can't just be about listing a few famous names.
No, definitely not. While highlighting heroes is important for visibility, we need to go deeper. Uplift the nuances and hidden histories, the collective movements, the everyday acts of resistance and connection, the bonds forged in silence.
And challenge that myth of perpetual progress.
Yes, we need to show that queer identities and gender variants aren't modern inventions. We need to point to the exceptions to these erasures throughout history, across cultures, to show that marginalization is a product of power, not some natural state.
And be careful with labels.
Critically important. Think beyond the acronym, like LGBTQIA. While useful now, imposing modern Western labels onto the past can distort understanding. We need to respect historical terms from different cultures. The Muxes in Zapotec society, the Natalihi among the Navajo, the Hijras in South Asia.
Focus on the lived experiences themselves.
Exactly. Focus on the precedent of lived experiences. Recognizing these diverse, long-standing histories provides that crucial guidepost. It gives queer students, queer people today, a sense of lineage, allowing them to move with the spirit of the people who came before them. It builds resilience.
This isn't just for queer students, though. It's for everyone.
Absolutely. A truthful, inclusive history benefits everyone. It empowers marginalized communities by affirming their presence and contributions, yes, but it also enriches all of our understanding of humanity. It reveals a much fuller, more complex, more vibrant fabric of humanity.
It expands our capacity for empathy, for understanding.
And ultimately for building a more just future.
We've covered so much ground today, really navigating some deep and often difficult waters, exploring how blackness and queerness have been so deeply intertwined.
From the horrifying power dynamics and unexpected intimacies of slavery in the Middle Passage,
To the brilliant bursts of creativity in the Harlem Renaissance and the ongoing struggles against dual burdens and historical erasure.
we've seen how the past isn't really past at all. It's constantly shaping our present community dynamics, internal conflicts, media narratives.
Yeah. And these stories, these recovered histories, they really challenge us, don't they? They push us to think differently about power, about what liberation truly means, maybe even what it means to be human.
Acknowledging the complexity, the fluidity on the ships, the strategic unpleasantness of artists, the hidden stories behind public tragedies, it gives us a much richer, more authentic picture of resilience.
So here's something to maybe leave you thinking about. How might our whole understanding of power shift if we fully embrace the truth that the very people deemed property, whose identities were violently controlled and erased,
We're often the ones demonstrating the most profound forms of human freedom through their existence, their bonds, their refusal to be completely broken.
what does it truly mean to be free? And what else could we learn about ourselves, about our history, about the human spirit, if we keep listening for those secrets whispered by the queer Atlantic, those legacies carried in bodies and stories across time?
It's a history that demands our attention, not just for understanding the past, but for shaping a better future.